Yeah, I think you're in the middle, right?
I thought I was here.
Okay.
I don't know. We're good? Good evening, everyone.
Good.
Or good afternoon, or whatever it may be. I'm Jane Harmon, and I'm the moderator of this conversation. And although he's not here, boo on him, I do want to salute the wonderful service here of Ivo Dalder, our former ambassador to NATO. Did a superb job, and I spent 10 years at the Wilson Center of Blessed Memory. The Trump administration has reduced the staff now to, or is reducing it to 5 people, but it was the living memorial to our 28th President Woodrow Wilson. But each year, Ivo would come with the annual report from the Chicago Council, and we would release it there, and I was very proud to do it, and I'm very proud that he's my friend. I also want to say, I was looking at the list of members and people. I send my fondest wishes to the Crown family, especially Lester and Renee, who've been dear friends forever and just stalwarts in Chicago. So I met Zbig in the Carter White House, where I was the deputy cabinet secretary. That was a pretty big deal. He was the national security advisor, and one of his vaunted aides was Madeleine Albright, a good friend of mine, and she went on, I know, not only to be, she was his student, but also to be his assistant over the years. And he was the smartest person in the White House. Jimmy Carter would agree. Carter would be as smart. And we all looked up and respected him. Some were intimidated. I suppose I was. But I appreciated his friendship and really admire his career. So let me add one more thing. My father, I've been waiting to tell this to Ian, my father was Polish, born in southeastern Poland in a little town called Jasło. I guess it's not that little. But I share something with you, my friend. I guess you weren't born there, but you certainly spent time, and you look and sound exactly like your father, but with less hair. So, Ed and Ian have been practicing for this event, because I know this because I was on my treadmill on Friday, and there they were on Morning Joe, which has someone on it regularly named Mika Brzezinski, Ian's sister. And I guess you were on the show all last week, Ed. You've been everywhere with this amazing book.
I was like the Iranian hostage crisis. It was like day 3, day 4, day 5.
Well, this book is getting a lot of attention and excellent reviews for a reason. It's excellent. I finally finished it on the plane today. I've been carrying it around. It weighs about 18 pounds. And it's on the table over there. And you should know that following this event, Ed will sign books, and you have to buy them, but he will sign them. And so please take advantage. So Ed Luce serves as the U.S. national editor and columnist at the Financial Times. He's had a variety of other jobs there, very big jobs. He also, before joining FT, worked as a speechwriter for Larry Summers at Treasury during the Clinton administration. Prolific author, you obviously know this. He's on every television show, and many times, often on Morning Joe. Ian, who is the Republican Brzezinski, interesting, is a resident senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center, a member of the Atlantic Council Strategic Advisory Group, and leads the Brzezinski Group, which advises government and commercial clients. Previously served in some key government roles, and I'm going to ask him about that during a certain war that I wrongly voted for. But anyway, he worked. Well, we'll go there. I'm not going to blow it yet. So the plan today is to ask questions and then go to audience questions, including some in the chat, because this panel is live on Zoom, and the Chicago Council has many smart people in this audience, but also tuning in this way. The program is on the record. Any views expressed by the speakers are their own and do not reflect institutional positions. And I will now have a glass of water. So let's start with the news today. I will ask Ed why he wrote the book, etc. But everybody's dying to know what our panelists make of the day, the phone call, between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. And why am I asking this? Because certainly my theory of the case is Putin has played 5 presidents, starting when he became head of Russia after the Cold War ended, and that he's playing President Trump. And tragically, I'm in full-on Ukraine here with my bravery scarf. The people on the short end or with the fewer cards are the Ukrainians. And I would just make one other point. I'd be very interested in comments from both of you. I think that if Trump loses Ukraine, it's a word he hates, if he's a loser in Ukraine, that will hurt his legacy more than the way Biden left Afghanistan. So let me just put out there my theory of the case and ask both of you, maybe starting with Ed, what you thought of the phone call today and what you think is going on between those two men.
Well, thank you, Jane. Thank you, Chicago Council. As many of you know, Neve, my wife, Neve King, was Director of Programs here. Golden age of Neve, which I'm still living through, thankfully. And it's a delight to be here. I think I came here a bit when you first opened this room and moved to this building. So it's great to see it back in action. So as regards Ukraine, well, you know, I would like to defer to Ian because Ian just got back from Ukraine. So I think, and Ian, of course, speaks some Ukrainian. And this does feature in my biography of his dad, the period in the 90s where you were based there in Ukraine and where Brzezinski Sr., Zbig, was really very, very aggressively and effectively. He knew no other approach than to be quite aggressive, as you know, very aggressively pushing for Ukraine to be given its due and to be supported by the West in its separate status from Russia after independence in 1991. And that's a reasonably large chunk of the sort of later chapters of my biography of your dad. But I think Ian, you know, is really up to date on that.
And
let's throw it to Ian.
Let me just add to that. What would your dad be saying right now?
Well, let me thank the council for including me in this, and Jane, thank you for moderating this, and Ed, congratulations on a great book. And I say that as about as objectively as I can be as a Brzezinski. You know, Ukraine was very much in the forefront of my dad's thinking ever since he was in university, and even as a master's, and possibly as Ed as an undergraduate. But his master's thesis at McGill talked about what he saw as a core weakness of the Soviet Union, and that was the fractures created by its different nationalities that constituted it. And he always realized that Ukraine within the Soviet Union, as opposed to just the Soviet Union and its empire, including the Warsaw Pact, that Ukraine was the most important nationality, the one that had the greatest weight in terms of population, economic weight, agricultural power, and such. So he was always watching Ukraine to see how fervent its move for independence would be. And as it alighted in the late 80s, and actually was one of the catalysts that fragmented the Soviet Union, he was very animated about that and thought it was extremely important to secure Ukraine as a democratic, sovereign European state. And it had a profound impact on me personally, because when I was working for the Bush administration and got beat by the Clinton administration, I was looking for something new to do. And so he said, Ian, you know, you should go to Ukraine. You should go live in Ukraine. Because he said that is where the future of Europe, that's where the future of the European security architecture is going to be determined by the success or failure of independent Ukraine. And so I went there for 2 years and worked as a volunteer. So fast forward to today.
Were you there, though, in 1994 when Ukraine gave up its nukes?
Yes, I was there in 93 and 94.
For respect for its sovereignty from Russia and all the other states?
And that was a very bearish moment on part of the United States, because I was sitting in Kiev watching U.S. policy, which If you're ever interested in the Korean foreign affairs, there's nothing more valuable than going over in another country, living with the citizens, so to speak, and seeing the exercise of American power. And it can be daunting. But in that agreement, the United States basically told Ukrainians, you give up those nuclear weapons and you accept these terms, or you're on your own. And Ukrainians knew they were signing a weak agreement. They were looking for guarantees, not assurances. But to fast forward to today, and today's conversation, for those of you who aren't aware, Trump and Putin had a 2-hour conversation. And it's not clear what came out of it, but it seems to me, based on Trump's statement, that he wants to kind of turn the negotiations more over to the Ukrainians and the Russians on their own, which is kind of backing away. He signaled a distancing from this, and then kind of jumped into his hopes for a great trade relationship with Russia. So from my perspective, and I think my dad would agree with this, is that Putin probably walked away from this agreement emboldened, more confident that he can get out of Ukraine what he wants through the use of force, more confident the United States isn't going to intervene. And in the case of Trump, it was a complete failure to leverage the power of American power, military, economic, and political, to bring a peace, to force Russia to really take negotiations seriously. It was a missed opportunity.
Well, do you think he sees Putin in the terms that he sees most countries? I mean, real estate. He's going to do a big, beautiful deal with Putin. Or in the case of the Middle East, I forget who said it this weekend, but it was the takeaway from Trump with the Arab Sunni countries was he hates war, he loves gold. And do you think, don't you think that's a complete misreading of Putin, KGB trained, and not a guy who would make a deal like that?
I think it's a good reading. I mean, interesting what Ed would say, but when I look at Trump and Ukraine, I kind of look with two conclusions. One, Trump has articulated a foreign policy in which he does not see America having vital security interests in Europe. He sees Europe as a region where we sell our goods and the home of our economic competitors. So that's a bad starting point if you're traditional. A believer in a traditional American foreign policy, sees vital interests in Europe. Second, when he looks at kind of engagements abroad, he takes, quote unquote, an investor's approach. Yeah. He will throw out some money on Gaza, money on India, Pakistan, China, tariffs, and such. And then, like most investors, they spread their money. They look where they're going to get wins. And those that are doing well bring returns, and they invest more in. Those that aren't, they pull out. That's why I've been very worried and take very seriously Trump's threat to, quote unquote, withdraw from these negotiations and remove American power from the equation of this war, which of course would be a huge setback for Ukraine, be a huge setback for European security, and ultimately a real setback for American security interests.
Yeah, I think the shorthand will be Trump lost Ukraine. Trump's the loser. But Ed, if you want to add to this, otherwise I want to ask you why you wrote this book right now.
Let's go to Zbig.
Okay.
Yes,
Zbig, the book.
We can relate it back to today.
Okay.
But Ian said it pretty well, I think.
Very well. Okay. Why did you write this book now? And how did you possibly write this glorious, big, beautiful book with all this detail amidst all your television appearances, your op-eds, and your life with Neve?
Well, it's dedicated to Neve for a reason. She tolerated my being locked in the attic. I did have a joke. I put a joke in the book, in the acknowledgements, that so much of what your dad was dealing with in the 70s, including SALT I and SALT II. SALT I was negotiated by Kissinger, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. SALT II was negotiated by the Carter administration, by Cy Vance. But anyway, Neve said, so immersed was I in Zbig that whenever she asked me to pass the salt, I would say SALT I or SALT II. That's how bad I got. But so I started in COVID. And the reason why I did it was because there hasn't been a full life biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski. And he was the great rival frenemy, I call it, of Henry Kissinger. Really from 1938, not quite from then, poetically, they both crossed the Atlantic to Europe, up to 2017 when Zbig died. Almost sort of cinematic rivalry that goes through the decades of the Cold War and then afterwards. And Brzezinski hasn't had a full, complete sort of appraisal. The story of his life is a remarkable story. Kissinger's had many. He did cooperate with them. And so when the Brzezinski family, without strings attached, said, I could have access to all the materials, including the diaries that he kept when he was National Security Advisor, that he would dictate into a dictaphone in the car back from the White House every evening to McLean, Virginia. The moment, I started reading those, but also all the other stuff, you get addicted. And the more you know, the more you want to know. And I think, Kissinger was an extraordinary figure. He outranked Brzezinski in terms of name recognition. I mean, he was that rare thing, a foreign policy celebrity. There was a sitcom in Britain in the early 70s called Fawlty Towers, and it had John Cleese as the main character. And there were a couple of Kissinger jokes. Now, I can't imagine there being Brzezinski jokes, but in terms of their respective impacts on the Cold War and on Cold War strategy, I would say Brzezinski was a bigger figure, as they say. And
I'm
so
sure you've practiced that line.
Well, the whole thing, when Madeleine Albright, who was his protege, as you know, and his PhD student, when she moved from when Brzezinski poached her at the beginning of the Carter administration to work on his staff, she moved from Ed Muskie's Senate office to the White House, and Muskie warned her, Zbig will make you feel small. But actually, he didn't. I mean, he built up her career.
Well, it's actually in the book, Muskie comes back as Secretary of State, and that doesn't...
He does indeed.
That doesn't go so well, at Madeleine's recommendation.
It does not go so well. He replaces Cy Vance. That didn't go so well. The battle between State Department and Brzezinski was a constant feature of the Carter administration. And he did win most of the battles, ultimately. China normalization being absolutely key, nuclear modernization being key, regressive response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and so on. I mean, these are not just interesting histories to tell for the sake of history. These are issues that are surfacing now.
Well, Carter is remembered, though, and I remember it at the time, for adding human rights as a plank of foreign policy. That was not Zbig, right? Am I right?
No, Zbig weaponized it. Carter believed in human rights everywhere. I think Zbig cared even more about human rights behind the Iron Curtain than he did in some other places.
There was a certain focus and clear-eyed...
But this was the first presidency not to have Vietnam as an albatross around its neck. And it was the first, really, therefore, for 20 years, to take the ideological offensive back to the Soviet Union. And it did so through something that Ian had been working on since his McGill thesis in 1950, in which he talked of the Soviet Union having an Achilles heel. And that Achilles heel was the suppressed nations, not just of the Warsaw Pact, but within the USSR, Ukraine, Georgia, Kazakhstan, etc. And that was... They didn't see themselves as Soviet citizens. They saw themselves as belonging to a Russian empire dressed in Marxist clothing. And that he saw this as the key of awakening peace through peaceful engagement, not through direct military confrontation, but through peaceful engagement, awakening a process of which human rights was an absolutely integral tool, and samizdat and freedom of movement and freedom of religion, etc., as a way of awakening the unraveling of what he saw as the last great empire.
Fascinating. Well, for those who haven't read the book yet, he grew up with some privilege. His father was a diplomat. We're talking about Zbig's father. They moved to Canada. He was first got Canadian citizenship, didn't he, before he got U.S. citizenship? But Ian, you weren't born yet, right? When were you? You were born in the U.S.
I was born in the U.S.
In the U.S. Well, let's talk about you. The book is full of policy, but it's also full of family and the horse in the kitchen, and I mean it's crazy.
Strawberry.
And Strawberry, the horse, and ducks, and this wacko picture of Zbig with a duck. And sort of chaos, Mika spilling food in Deng Xiaoping's lap and so on. I mean, what was it like growing up Brzezinski, and what did you learn in terms of the person you became from all that?
Well, I want to thank Ed because, and this may not reflect well on me, but I learned a huge amount from Ed and from reading this book about my family. And it makes me really wonder, had I asked not enough? And I'd encourage everyone who's got parents, ask your parents a lot, because there's a lot you don't know. But in terms of our upbringing, we were very lucky. I mean, my father was very much a family man. And it was every weekend, maybe this is a Central European thing, we always had family walks. If it was New Jersey, it was along the Palisades. If it was in my teenage years, it was along the Potomac with our dogs. And my dad, everyone thinks of him kind of a formal guy, but our big game was we would run and hide from the dogs. So he'd go running off, hiding behind some trees or under some rocks, and I'd be holding the dog, and the dog would zoom after it. But these were also times where we always had family discussions. So there was always a subject. And a lot of it was, what's going on in school. A big dose of it was geopolitics and that sort of thing. Family dinners always had kind of very substantive discussion themes. You mentioned our animals. I mean, my dad was very, very frugal. So you were talking about how he grew up in an elevated stature as the son of a diplomat in Montreal. Well, they lost all of that after World War II, and they went to an almost near penury in terms of living. So my dad always had care about how he spent his money. He was very, very frugal, except on two things: my mother's art and her love of animals. So if it came to an investment into her art projects, he was always there for her. If it was she wanted a horse, she got her horse. We had ducks, we had chickens, we had dogs, we had cats.
The horse in the kitchen? I mean, that seems a bit unusual.
Well, the horse was a pony, a large pony, but it felt very much at home and would often walk into the house. We left the door open.
And as I recall,
Strawberry have a taste for Polish vodka as well.
She loved
I was going there with the Polish. The horse did shots of Polish vodka.
So a family tradition we had was, even at an extremely young age, around 10, 9, 8, we were even given shots at big family events, so like Christmas and Easter or a birthday. And one day the horse came in and we were looking at it, it's looking at us in the dining room. My dad went up and gave it a shot, and if a horse's mouth will go up like that, so it looks like it's smiling in reaction to the sharp alcohol, but she liked it. Maybe that's why you get back into the house.
Well, let's move on a little bit here. We mentioned the Kissinger relationship, and frenemies would probably be right, at least as you describe it. But how did it start and how did it end? I mean, there were some descriptions in the book of Henry, I think it was, calling Clinton and saying and criticizing Brzezinski. And Clinton didn't want Brzezinski in the room. Then he asked later, well, what was the call about?
With Carter.
With Carter.
Yeah.
I don't mean Clinton. I mean Carter.
Yeah. So they were rivals at Harvard in the 50s. They first met in 1950. But they were rivals at Harvard, but not like at each other's throats, because Brzezinski was a Sovietologist, Russian-speaking Sovietologist, and Kissinger was a diplomatic historian. So they weren't quite in the same field. But they got, they were the two great luminaries, I think, foreign accented, emigre, refugee, hired, and, meteoric rise up academia. And then Brzezinski didn't get tenure at Harvard and moved to Columbia, set up the center, referring to what I was talking about earlier, for the study of comparative communism. And this was absolutely key, because Sovietologists until then saw the Soviet Union as a monolith. And his point was, it's not a monolith, it's a mosaic, and we can play with it. And then they intersected a lot. Council on Foreign Relations was a sort of key in those days, the crucible of American foreign policy. The Waterloo, what he called the Waterloo of the WASP elites, Vietnam, was starting to happen. But it was only in 1968 when Nixon won, and Hubert Humphrey, who Brzezinski had been the foreign policy advisor to, lost, partly because of what happened in this town at that convention, that notorious convention. It was only when a couple of weeks after the election, Nixon offers Kissinger not only to be his national security advisor, but to be his all-powerful one, with the Secretary of State.
Kissinger, who had worked for Rockefeller, his opponent.
Nelson Rockefeller.
Yes. Nelson Rockefeller, and said very nasty things about Nixon along the way.
Yes.
And had barely met him, got this offer.
It literally met him once. And so it was a shock to Nixon. It was a shock to Brzezinski. And it was on that day that their rivalry began, because Brzezinski think, okay, this guy with a foreign accent can make it to the top. I can make it to the top. And he actually went out and bought a notebook and wrote down who would be in his national security council when he became national security
But wait a minute. He had worked for Kennedy in a junior role. He had worked for Lyndon Johnson. I mean, this guy was not just a neophyte. I mean, we're talking about Zbig. And he worked for every president. And Reagan was even interested in hiring him along the way, as you describe.
He was. But I think he thought he would be, if Hubert Humphrey had won, and it was a way closer election than people might recall. He thought if Hubert Humphrey had won, he would have been like Deputy Secretary of State or something like that. Pretty big job. It turns out he probably would have been made National Security Advisor. The people I know who worked, who was plenty of people, including John Riley, formerly of this council, who were on Hubert Humphrey's campaign, Robert Hunter is another, said they all assumed if Hubert Humphrey had won, Brzezinski would have been the first immigrant with a funny accent to become National Security Advisor. But it was Nixon and therefore Kissinger. And that's when what was a mutually respecting friendship or acquaintance at the very least turns into this frenemyship. And that's when it really gets quite legendary. And it really dominated American foreign policy in the 70s. Zbig versus Kissinger.
Well, don't we miss both of them? I mean, where is this beyond life-sized strategist out there who can see the world the way each of them did?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean,
maybe it's Ian
should answer.
Yeah.
I was going to add, when Ed was going through the family papers, it kind of forced me to kind of go through the family papers too. And one of the things that struck me about their relationship was one, where these two guys came from. I mean, there's a picture of them sitting on one of the steps of one of the Harvard buildings. It's him, Jim Schlesinger, Hank Brown,
Harold Brown,
Sam Huntington. I mean, these were the greats of policy, all sitting in one cluster at this university. And that relationship between Kissinger and my dad went through years. And the way I kind of, learning from Ed's work, I kind of looked at them as akin to two tennis players on the same team, vying for the top spot. And I really felt that even though they just disagreed profoundly with each other in how to approach the Soviet Union and the challenges of the era, they still had enormous respect for each other. Because what I was amazed by was the number of letters that we came across between them. One criticizing or praising. I remember one from Kissinger saying, after Brzezinski had really harshly criticized one of his policies, I always remember that my best friends are actually my critics. And that relationship became tense during the competitive period of the 70s, but warmed up a lot towards the late 80s and intensified a bit in the 90s. And when my dad passed away, Kissinger wrote an unbelievably moving letter to my mother about how he cried when he learned about my father's death. I think it was actually a closer relationship and a closer competition than most people recognize.
Mm.
I did do some, Kissinger gave me several interviews for this book. And I asked him, so where would you rank Brzezinski in terms of Cold War strategists? And he goes, he would certainly be in the top 2.
And we clearly know what that meant, don't we? That's interesting. Well, speaking of rivalries or differences, I mentioned that you're the Republican Brzezinski, and you worked in the Bush administration, and then came the issue of the Iraq War. I was in Congress at the time. I remember it vividly. I remember I was the senior Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, reading every shred of intelligence I could find to justify launching a war against Saddam Hussein. And I remember coming home convinced that it was the right thing to do, voting for the resolution, learning later that some of the sources were suspect, and the intelligence was cherry picked, and the conclusion was forced, or that's how I saw it. And I said at the time, sadly, the intel was wrong and I was wrong. You went through something with all this, Ian. You were a supporter, and I think your dad was against the war. Do I remember this right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And at the time, how did that go? And what do you think about it now?
That was a subject, was among the more lively subjects in the family discussions. As I remember the evolution of my dad's thinking on that decision to invade Iraq, he went through a brief period, maybe akin to yours, where he agreed with the need to use force. But then and I can't remember exactly now quite the exact date, I think it was actually after the invasion began, but maybe Ed's got more a sharper focus on it. He didn't realize that we'd gotten into something that we couldn't manage. He was very skeptical of the rationale for it, and then became extremely worried about over the execution of the war and what the implications would be for Iraq, for the region, and American interests in the region and our global stature. And so he was one of the, I would say, kind of earlier opponents that really brought a kind of forceful intellectual argument against what we'd gotten ourselves into. The difference I had with my dad, and maybe with you too, was that based on what we knew at that time, the administration had would have been very difficult for the administration not to take action, because there was a lot of evidence indicating that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, was willing to share it. And in fact, in hindsight, it looks like that was actually Saddam Hussein's strategy, to create an impression that he had these systems to deter an American attack. So he kind of created a dynamic that left the Bush administration with no other choice in light of what happened in the,
Well, there's another side to that, which is that he thought he had weapons of mass destruction, and his staff knew he didn't, but they knew if they told him this, they would lose their jobs and their lives.
Well, this is about Zbig, but I would say while I was not in the Iraq circle, I was close to it, and I don't think there was a false creation of intelligence. I think there were a lot of mistakes that were made in the decisions around Afghanistan, the execution of it. I can go in
around Iraq, Afghanistan, or Iraq?
Iraq. But the assertion that people were fixing the intelligence, I think, is false. I'm confident it's false.
Okay. Well,
from a biographical point of view, there were two really important things about your dad's early opposition to the Iraq War, which, as you say, comes after the war begins. And he says, I think, about 3-4 weeks afterwards, that obviously there's no WMD because they would have been used. And so it was pretty obvious sort of early on. But he was very, very early, him and Brent Scowcroft, in coming out against it. And I think biographically, in terms of the sort of the storylines, there's two really interesting things here. And one is he did feel embarrassed not to have come out against the Vietnam War earlier. And to some extent, the speed with which he when there was generally consensus at that point that the war was a good thing, he and Brent Scowcroft came out as a sort of this sort of twin double act, and they became a very popular double act. And the second is that this is why he endorsed Obama early. And he endorsed Obama in 2007 at a point when Hillary Clinton was hitting him with the 3 a.m. ads and saying Obama's just not got the experience as mostly a senator from Springfield to be the president of the United States. And Obama was able to call on, the Democrat, the most hawkish Democrat, at least in memory, who had been known as Darth Vader by the left in the 1970s. He was the Darth Vader. For Obama to be able to get your dad's endorsement was, and I had talked a lot to the Obama people, it was a punch the air moment for them because this neutralized Hillary Clinton's attack.
And Zbig offered to introduce Obama, and it was a whole big deal.
Yes.
And to remind, going back to Jimmy Carter, Carter credited him really with teaching him foreign policy. Carter read huge amounts of material, and you describe how the Trilateral Commission was formed, and Carter was the first governor, Democratic governor, to be asked to be a member, and so forth. And so he really, he's had an extraordinary impact. I want to ask one more question. There's no time clock showing, people, so I'm not sure I'm right, but here it is. Was he introspective, your father? Did he admit to mistakes? What would he say were his biggest mistakes? I didn't notice that in the book. Maybe that was there, but just wondering.
The introspection you did.
Mm-hmm.
What was his biggest mistake? I have to say,
what would he say was his biggest mistake?
My father rarely admitted mistakes.
Please line up. There's a microphone right there, and we're going to also take some questions from the chat. Excuse me.
I think he would probably say, look back on his biggest mistake, he would probably look at his support for the Vietnam War, I think. And that's one that resonated in the years that followed, because despite his image as his critics would call him a warmonger, someone who would use force unreasonably against the Soviet Union, would risk nuclear war, whereas in fact he was very, very, very cautious about the application of force. In part, that's a reflection of his experience as a refugee who saw his country and his people destroyed by the devastation of war. His background as a strategist who had a fundamental understanding of what would happen with a nuclear war. That permeated into Iraq and his thinking on Iraq. So if I had to pick an issue where I think he might admit making a mistake, it would probably be the 60s when he supported a U.S. effort to defeat the communists in Vietnam.
Ian, you told me that the only time you saw him literally grey-faced was after the failed Iran hostage rescue attempt. Wouldn't he have put that on the list?
I don't think so. I think he was great. The story is that my father was an early advocate for a rescue mission to free the U.S. hostages taken in Iran. And so he among the cabinet probably was the most, certainly among the most bullish on the prospects of such an effort and the need to do so. So when the president launched that mission, my father knew that he had direct responsibility for it, because that's what he was urging the president to do. And of course, it ended in a tragedy with the helicopters with a helicopter and the C-130 colliding in the desert outpost, Desert One, and aborting the mission, but also tremendous loss of life of U.S. Special Forces. And my father had to keep a routine during that day so that no one would know the mission was going on. So he had to go to his meetings as if nothing was going on and come home as if nothing was going on. Wow. And so he came home after that, shortly after that crash, and he was gray. The only 2 times I've seen him like that was when he walked in the door of our house on Spring Hill Road in McLean and on his deathbed. Well, he was shocked by it because he felt personal responsibility for it. I think he was most devastated by the loss of American lives in that, and then he was extremely concerned what he had done or he could contribute to the Carter presidency.
Well, but back it up. Didn't he want the Shah to leave Iran and come here for medical treatment? Was that your father?
Yes, he thought that was a matter of principle.
Which was a controversial decision, too.
Yeah, but that wouldn't leave him gray. That was a matter of U.S. stature and the confidence that our allies and supporters could have that would always back them, particularly in times of need. So that was a matter of principle. This moment when he was gray, it was because it was a body blow to something that he had advocated. It resulted in the loss of the lives of American heroes and jeopardized Carter's reelection prospects.
Sure. Oh, here's a question on the iPad. Are there questions in the room? I can't see. No questions? Chicago Council members have no questions? This is impossible. Oh, here we have one. Okay, identify yourself and ask a question, please.
My name is Jack Scanlon. I'm a member of the council. My question is, did his relationship with Carter change during the administration and with some of the setbacks?
So Jane mentioned earlier that in a funny way, Brzezinski picked Carter, not the other way around. I mean, the number of candidates, potential 72 and 76 Democratic candidates who approached him and said, could you be our... Because remember, this is the Kissinger sort of model. They're looking for Brzezinski as the Democratic Kissinger. And he picked Carter to join the Trilateral Commission as the one Democratic governor. Ruben Askew was the other, I think. And Carter used it as a crash course in the affairs of the world because he was not very engaged previously. And Brzezinski had to keep telling him after he started running, pioneering the Iowa model, as it happens in 75, 76, stop saying, I am an eager student of Zbig, because Americans don't want to elect a student. You know, they want to elect a leader. So Carter would take tutorials from Brzezinski, including in the White House. And when the state delegations, congressional delegations, business delegations were visiting, he'd have them there, in the ballroom, and he'd have Brzezinski give a grand, tour of what's going on in the world and what the Carter administration's position was. And Rosalind Carter would be sitting there taking notes. And so, again, he got a little bit awkward about this, saying the president should be a bit more presidential. Carter and he got along extremely well. I mean, to the extent that they could argue with each other, and Brzezinski could be quite rude and storm out. And there were a couple of letters where Carter sent on White House letterhead, Zbig, do you ever know when to stop? This was not a Rubin-Trump relationship. It was very stand-up fight, but as almost as intellectual equals. Carter was the decider, and events pushed things towards the view that Brzezinski was advising him to take, which was to be tougher with the Soviets. Cy Vance ultimately started to lose most of the battles. And as Jane said at the beginning, really the predicates for Reaganism, at least on foreign policy, were laid down in the last 2 years of the Carter administration, which is one of the reasons Reagan wanted to hire Zbig as his national security advisor.
That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. You also pointed out, Ed, that Carter didn't like the social circuit in Washington, and Carter, that Brzezinski did not, and your mother did not, and the Carters did not, and so they invited the Brzezinskis or the Vances over for dinner in the White House regularly, and that was
and to Camp David
Camp David, and that was their social circle. That's fascinating. Okay, we have another question.
Barry Greenman, a new member. The question is that did Brzezinski ever consider the idea of whether we should try to insulate our intelligence from being tampered with because of Vietnam or Iraq?
So the big intelligence thing then was the fall of Iran, because all of the CIA's best listening posts to monitor Soviet nuclear weapons testing was on the Iranian-Soviet border. And when the revolution happened and the Shah fled, those Thakman listening posts were immediately lost. And it coincided with the normalization with China. And one of the fruits of that was they could then be moved almost instantly to Xinjiang, to northwest China, which were even better positioned to monitor Soviet nuclear testing in Kazakhstan. That was a sort of big intelligence sort of change during the Carter years. But there was a lot of sort of post-Watergate church committee attempt to clean the Augean stables after Watergate. The perception the CIA had been running rogue and the FBI had been running rogue was very strong. And Carter had this strong moral zeal, correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, that your father didn't entirely share. He wanted to quite use the CIA, and he did start to use the CIA, for example, in Afghanistan.
But you properly point out, Ed, that during those years is when the FISA passed, the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Act, Congress's main law that's still in effect, more or less.
Absolutely.
And Congress stood up the intelligence committees to correct the abuses by Nixon. Yeah, I kind of know this period.
You know this backwards.
Anyway, Ian, you wanted to add something.
I want to ask Ed a question. Can I do that?
Yes, and then we have 2 questions on the iPad, and no one else is standing up, so that's what we'll do. We'll go you first, Ian.
So, Ed, you know, you didn't start this biography totally from scratch, because you actually had a relationship with my dad for a number of years. You're one of his closer friends. The question I have for you, based on all the research you've done, what did you discover that surprised you, that was new, and that surprised you most about your research about my dad?
That's one of. I mean, one of the. It feels really, really awkward for me to be sitting here talking about your dad and you're sitting there, because you know a lot more about your dad than I do. And I've had that same feeling with Mika in the past few days. Why am I telling you about your dad? What surprised me, well, tons of stuff surprised me. I mean, you know, I got into, as you know, I got the diaries. I think you were the one who gave me the diaries of him as a child, in Polish, covering the Second World War, well, of the arrival in Canada, the passage across the Atlantic. From then on, had to be translated, obviously, and read, because the handwriting was pretty indecipherable. And your grandmother's, his mother's, Leonia's diaries. And what surprised me more than all the sort of foreign policy revelations, all the time that was almost nuclear war, and he didn't wake you and your mother and the kids up, because he didn't want to spoil your last 30 minutes of life. That was quite something. But what really surprised me was how novelistic, because a biography is about what is the making of this person. What are their formative years? What is it that sort of drives them? I mean, I knew when I started researching this that it was his actions as a public figure, and the Cold War and the post-Cold War and Iraq and all these things that drew me initially to your dad. To his brain, which I'd had, been privileged enough to have access to as a journalist on occasions. But what really surprised me was just how deeply invested I became in, okay, this is a life story. And as a journalist, the closest biography that nonfiction gets to fiction in narrative form is biography. Because it's a story with a beginning, a middle, an end, characters, a plot. And your dad's character and the arc of his life, Warsaw, interbellum Warsaw, that brief flowering of the Polish Republic before it's brutalized and vivisected by the Soviets and the Nazis, right up to that last public event in December 2016 at Oslo, when your dad's being given kind of a lifetime Nobel Prize Achievement Award, but Kissinger's next to him on the stage. all those years later, this is a really cinematic arc. And so it was more that. It's an extraordinary story, your dad's story. And he was an incredible character. And it's your dad. I'm feeling more and more self-conscious as I talk.
And they look so much alike. Two more questions.
You have,
Let's get these in. One, was Brzezinski the architect of the demise of the Soviet Union?
Ian should answer a question about his dad.
He was a key architect. I mean, you just can't say one person in American policy solely had a responsibility for that success. But what he did was he identified a key Achilles heel, and he was willing to kind of pound that heel, pound that nail, even at a time when it was totally disregarded. He was among few voices saying that we need to emphasize this. He weaponized the principle of human rights. I'm even a little bit, maybe because I'm biased, I'm a little bit more forward-leaning than Ed, that I think he actually thought that was an important contribution he made to U.S. foreign policy, working with Carter, working with Cy Vance, to make that a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy up until, I guess, until today. And then he also was, he was driven by, and to hark to his memoirs of his White House years, he was determined to leverage American power on behalf of principle, the principle of those rights, the principle of justice, to free countries from oppression. So he brought a certain amount of energy to a particular fracture point in the Soviet Union that was critical to leading to the demise of that empire.
So, great answer. Second question is about his correspondence and friendship with Pope John Paul II. And I know it's in the book that they conversed in Polish and about not just religious topics, but about geopolitics. And it's fascinating. So one of you, please tell that story.
Well, I'll give a sort of macro answer, and Ian should talk about having dinner with the Pope. Because I didn't have dinner with the Pope.
Well, maybe this one, Ed.
Maybe. Pope from Chicago, President from Chicago. What next?
And is he a member of the council?
Yeah,
sign him
Not
up.
yet. Yeah.
The serendipity, the chance just of having the first non-Italian Pope in almost half a millennium be a Pole. And a Pole that Brzezinski knew, well, not well, but he'd met and had long conversation with. That would happen at the same time as you've got the first and so far last Polish-speaking grand strategist in the White House. And this relationship begins. And as Ian knows, because I think he was there at the Vatican embassy for that dinner, the joke that Brzezinski cracked to the Pope after the Pope had come in with him from the White House with his meeting with Carter was that the Pope was like a world statesman and Carter was like a religious leader. And they kept cracking this joke over
Carter was the Baptist teacher.
Yeah, Sunday school preacher. He exactly was.
Yeah.
And he knew. But the other, so of course, their correspondence in Polish and the fact that Brzezinski had P for Pope on his White House phone. So he had a Vatican hotline. He just pressed P.
Oh, cool.
Was key in the thing that history has not given Carter and Brzezinski enough credit for, which is the Soviet non-invasion of Poland. History doesn't thank you for what didn't happen, but that relationship was key in making Poland look like, indigestible, like a porcupine. It was a very, very important, pivotal relationship.
Well, let's hope that Ukraine becomes indigestible. That would be a thought. And that this Pope Leo, who's offered to host some of the conversations, I think now, this
Indeed.
is as of today or yesterday, between Russia and Ukraine in hopes of achieving peace, can be as effective in this world now, especially since he's from Chicago, as John Paul II was. I mean,
can I just ask Ian?
Yes,
because Ian had dinner with the Pope.
end, so people can buy your book and sign your book, unless you don't care about that anymore.
And Deng Xiaoping. So it is quite something from childhood. The first visit by a Chinese leader to America in history. the first night is at your home and your mum's
It's
cooking.
just-
And Carter, doesn't insist the Pope comes to the White House for the first night. I mean, the Pope, Deng Xiaoping, I beg your pardon, to the White House the first night.
Mhm.
He's at dinner with the Brzezinskis.
And that's where Mika spills food on him. And
exactly.
so
Yes.
forth.
Caviar
Is the
under
horse
that.
there? Did the horse get
So
invited?
the Pope.
I mean, it's quite amazing. You have to look at the pictures in the book. The horse is in the picture. Anyway, was this wonderful? Are they interesting? I don't know how you found time to do this. I really don't know how you found time to do this. But the idea of having an actual Brzezinski who looks like the other Brzezinski sitting next to you is quite spectacular. And so, again, thank you to both of you. Please go over to the corner there. I think Ed will be there. Please buy a book, and Ed will be happy to sign it for you. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you very much. That was lovely.